I'm a drone operator. I bombed a tank, then saw the children inside. The moment my Hellfire missile struck the T-72 tank, I knew something was wrong, not because of what I saw in the thermal imaging, not because of the secondary explosions that followed, but because of the way the tank seemed to scream, a sound that somehow transmitted through the satellite feed directly into my headset, a sound that no amount of steel and explosive could produce, a sound that could only come from human throats, small human throats. My name is Captain Sarah Mitchell, and I've been a drone operator for the United States Air Force for 8 years, stationed at Creech Air Force Base in Nevada, flying MQ-9 Reaper drones over conflict zones thousands of miles away, watching targets through screens that make death look like a video game, pressing buttons that end lives with a latency of 1.2 seconds between command and impact. I've killed before, many times, enemy combatants, terrorists, legitimate military targets all cleared through proper channels with legal authorization and rules of engagement protocols, and I've never lost sleep over it, because that's what warriors do in modern warfare. We compartmentalize, we follow orders, we trust the intelligence, and we execute the mission with precision and professionalism. But that tank in eastern Syria was different, and what I discovered in the weeks following that strike has shattered everything I thought I knew about modern warfare, about the enemies we fight, about the nature of the conflicts we're engaged in, and about things that should not exist in any rational universe but somehow do, hiding in plain sight on our targeting screens. It started as a routine reconnaissance mission on March 15, flying patterns over a contested area where Syrian government forces were engaged with various rebel factions, my job being to provide overwatch and identify potential threats to coalition forces operating in the region, standard stuff that I'd done hundreds of times before. The operations center at Creech is a windowless building filled with ground control stations, each one a small room containing pilot and sensor operator seats facing multiple screens showing aircraft telemetry, targeting data, and most importantly, the live feed from the drone's cameras powerful enough to read license plates from 25,000 feet. My sensor operator that day was Staff Sergeant Jake Torres, a good kid from Texas who'd been flying with me for 2 years, and we had developed the kind of wordless communication that comes from spending thousands of hours together in a small room, hunting targets half a world away while drinking bad coffee and eating vending machine food. The intelligence briefing had mentioned increased armor movement in our sector, Syrian army units repositioning for what analysts believed was preparation for an offensive against rebel-held territory, and our mission was to locate and track these units, providing real-time intelligence to command while maintaining readiness to engage if authorized. We found the tank column at 0800 local time, 6 T-72s moving in formation along a dusty road between abandoned villages, their heat signatures glowing white against the cooler desert background on our infrared display, textbook military movement that raised no immediate red flags beyond their presence in a contested area. But as we maintained our orbit at 24,000 feet, Jake noticed something odd about one of the tanks, the last one in the column, which seemed to be lagging behind the others and moving erratically, starting and stopping without apparent reason, its turret rotating randomly rather than maintaining disciplined sectors of fire. I zoomed the camera on the aberrant tank, switching between thermal and electro-optical views, trying to determine if it was experiencing mechanical problems or if this was some kind of deception tactic. When Jake pointed out something that made my blood run cold, there were no heat signatures from the crew compartments. Every tank has hot spots where the crew sits, human bodies radiating heat that shows clearly on thermal imaging, but this tank was cold inside except for the engine compartment, as if it was running on autopilot, which was impossible for a 1970s-era Soviet tank that required manual operation of every system. We reported the anomaly to the Mission Intelligence Coordinator, Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Webb, who was monitoring our feed from her station, and she authorized us to maintain surveillance on the suspicious vehicle while she consulted with higher command about whether it might be some kind of remote-controlled bomb or new type of weapon system. For the next hour, we watched the tank continue its erratic journey, sometimes stopping for minutes at a time, sometimes accelerating to dangerous speeds for the terrain, and always with that unsettling absence of crew heat signatures, until finally it separated completely from the main column and headed toward what our maps showed as an abandoned village. The village had been empty for years according to our intelligence, evacuated during earlier fighting and never repopulate, just another ghost town in a region full of them, but as the tank approached, we noticed movement in the ruins, heat signatures that appeared and disappeared too quickly to lock onto, as if whatever was moving knew exactly where our cameras were pointing. Colonel Webb ordered us to go weapons hot, authorizing engagement if the tank showed hostile intent toward coalition forces or civilians, and I armed the Hellfire missile while Jake kept the targeting laser locked on the vehicle, both of us tense with the anticipation that comes before a strike, that moment when you hold life and death in your trigger finger. The tank stopped in the center of the village, its turret rotating slowly as if searching for something, and that's when we saw them, small heat signatures emerging from the ruins and moving toward the vehicle, signatures too small to be adults, moving with the unmistakable gait of children, dozens of them converging on the tank. I immediately called out contact with potential civilians and requested abort authorization, my finger hovering over the master arm switch, but what happened next defied every protocol and precedent in my experience, because the children, if that's what they were, began climbing onto the tank, and one by one, they disappeared inside through hatches that opened without any visible crew assistance. Jake was frantically adjusting sensors, trying to get a clearer picture of what we were seeing, switching between every spectrum available to our cameras, and in one brief moment of clarity in the electro-optical view, we saw their faces, and I wish to God we hadn't, because they weren't quite right, weren't quite human, weren't quite anything that should exist. The feed glitched then, static washing across our screens for several seconds, and when it cleared, the tank was moving again, faster now, heading directly toward a known coalition outpost 8 kilometers away, and the thermal imaging showed it was no longer cold inside but blazing with heat signatures, far too many for a normal crew, packed into every available space within the armored shell. Colonel Webb's voice came through our headsets, calm and professional despite what we just witnessed, ordering immediate engagement, citing imminent threat to friendly forces, and I found myself mechanically going through the pre-fire checklist, even as my mind screamed that something was fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. The Hellfire launched at 0923 local time, the missile's journey tracked on our screens as a bright dot converging with the tank's heat signature, 11 seconds of flight time during which Jake and I said nothing, both of us knowing that we were about to kill children, whatever else they might be, and both of us knowing we had no choice. The impact was perfect, the missile striking the tank's turret ring, its shaped charge penetrating the armor and detonating inside, and for a moment everything looked normal, the expected fireball, the secondary explosions as ammunition cooked off, the thermal bloom that obscured our view for several seconds. But then came the screaming through our headsets, not the static or interference we sometimes got from electronic warfare, but actual screaming, dozens of voices in agony and rage, transmitted impossibly through our encrypted satellite link, and underneath the screams, something else, a rhythmic chanting in a language I didn't recognize but which made my teeth ache just hearing it. The thermal bloom cleared, revealing the destroyed tank, its turret blown completely off, internal fires consuming whatever remained inside, and around it, scattered on the ground, were cooling heat signatures, bodies thrown from the vehicle by the explosion, bodies that were too small, that shouldn't have been there, that we had just killed. I felt Jake's hand on my shoulder, gripping tight enough to hurt, and realized I was hyperventilating, my vision tunneling as the reality of what we'd done hit me, but before either of us could speak, movement on the screen caught our attention, movement from bodies that should have been dead, that were dead by any reasonable measure. The small figures were getting up, one by one, their heat signatures fading but still visible, moving with jerky, unnatural motions like marionettes with tangled strings, and they were walking toward our camera, looking up at our drone circling overhead, and I swear they were looking directly at us, not at the aircraft but at us, thousands of miles away in our control station. Colonel Webb was shouting in our headsets, demanding to know what we were seeing, but neither Jake nor I could form words to describe it, especially when the children began to change, their forms stretching and distorting on our screens, becoming something else, something that hurt to look at even through the filter of digital imagery. The feed cut out completely then, not a glitch or interference but a total loss of signal, and emergency protocols kicked in as we tried to re-establish contact with our aircraft, running through troubleshooting procedures while alarms blared and technicians rushed to our station, everyone assuming we'd been hit by some new form of electronic attack. It took 45 minutes to regain control of the drone, 45 minutes during which it flew on autopilot, maintaining its orbit over the destroyed tank, recording everything on its onboard systems, and when we finally re-established the link and downloaded that footage, we found 45 minutes of static interspersed with images that made no sense. The images showed the desert from impossible angles, as if the camera was seeing in more than 3 dimensions, showed the destroyed tank reassembling itself in reverse, showed the children climbing back inside, showed them looking at the camera with eyes that reflected something that wasn't light, and throughout it all, that chanting continued, recorded clear as day on systems that shouldn't have been able to capture audio. The immediate aftermath was a flurry of debriefings and technical analysis, experts trying to explain away what we'd seen as some kind of electronic warfare, psychological operation, or equipment malfunction, but Jake and I knew better, knew that something fundamental had changed the moment our missile struck that tank, something that couldn't be explained by conventional means. The official after-action report classified the entire incident, attributed the anomalies to a new type of Syrian electronic warfare system, and commended Jake and me for successfully engaging a hostile vehicle that posed a threat to coalition forces, but that night, neither of us could sleep, haunted by the sound of children screaming through impossible distances. Over the next few days, I began experiencing what I initially dismissed as stress-related symptoms, vivid nightmares where I was inside the tank when the missile hit, feeling the metal tear and the fire consume everything, but experiencing it from multiple perspectives simultaneously, as if I was every one of those children at once, feeling their pain and their rage and something else, something older and hungrier than human emotion. Jake was having similar experiences, though he was reluctant to discuss them in detail, just mentioning that he kept seeing things in his peripheral vision, small figures that disappeared when he turned to look, and that his dreams were filled with that rhythmic chanting, growing louder each night until he woke up with blood running from his ears. I started researching on my own time, digging through classified databases and intelligence reports, looking for any previous incidents that matched what we'd experienced, and what I found was a pattern hidden in bureaucratic language and technical jargon, a pattern of unexplained anomalies in drone operations dating back years. There were reports of feeds showing impossible geometries, of targets that appeared to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, of weapons impacts that produced effects inconsistent with known physics, all classified and explained away as equipment malfunctions or enemy deception, but taken together, they painted a picture of something systemic, something that had been happening for a long time. One report in particular caught my attention, from a Predator operator in Afghanistan in 2011 who claimed that after striking a compound, the feed showed the building reconstructing itself while dead bodies walked through walls, and that operator, I discovered through personnel records, had been medically discharged 3 months later after suffering what was described as a complete psychological breakdown. I tracked down that operator, Major David Chen, now living in a small apartment in Reno, working as a security guard and drinking himself to death, and when I showed up at his door wearing civilian clothes and told him I was a drone operator who had seen impossible things, he let me in without a word, as if he'd been waiting years for someone to believe him. Chen's apartment was covered in printouts and photographs, maps marked with incident locations, timelines showing patterns I hadn't noticed, and at the center of it all, a wall dedicated to what he called the broken spaces, areas where drone strikes had torn holes in something more than just buildings and bodies, holes that let in things that shouldn't exist. He told me about his incident in detail, how the compound they struck had been flagged as a high-value target based on signal intelligence, how the Hellfire had performed perfectly, killing everyone inside, and how afterwards, the feed had shown something emerging from the rubble, something that wore the bodies of the dead like clothing but moved with a coordination that suggested a single controlling intelligence. Chen had reported it, had been debriefed and told to forget what he'd seen, but he couldn't forget, especially when he started having what he called visitations, moments where reality would stutter and he would be back in his control station, watching that feed, except now he was also in the compound, experiencing the strike from both sides simultaneously. The Air Force had diagnosed him with PTSD and processed his medical discharge with unusual speed, but Chen believed it wasn't trauma causing his symptoms but actual contact with something beyond normal human experience, something that drone warfare had inadvertently given access to our world by creating connections between distant spaces that were never meant to touch. He showed me other cases he'd documented, operators who had reported similar anomalies and subsequently been removed from flight status, and there was a clustering effect. Certain geographic areas where these incidents were more common, places that Chen had identified as having specific characteristics, ancient sites, areas of historical trauma, locations where the boundary between dimensions was already thin. Eastern Syria, where our incident had occurred, was one of these places, home to ruins dating back millennia, site of countless battles and massacres throughout history, a land soaked in blood and pain that Chen believed made it vulnerable to incursions from what he called adjacent realities, dimensions that pressed against our own, waiting for cracks to appear. The children, he said, probably weren't children at all but entities taking familiar forms, using shapes that would cause hesitation in operators trained to avoid civilian casualties, and the tank wasn't being driven by them but was itself a kind of doorway, a mobile breach point that they were using to expand their influence into our reality. I wanted to dismiss Chen as delusional, but everything he said matched our experience too closely, and when he showed me classified footage he'd somehow retained from other incidents, footage showing similar impossible events following drone strikes, I couldn't deny that we were dealing with something beyond conventional explanation. Chen gave me a warning before I left, told me that once you'd seen through the cracks, you couldn't unsee them, that the entities knew you knew, and that they would start pushing at the boundaries of your perception, testing how much distortion your mind could handle before it broke completely, and that most operators who experienced these events didn't last 6 months before complete psychological collapse. I returned to duty the next day, trying to maintain normalcy, but everything felt different in the control station. The screens seemed to show depths that weren't there, shadows that moved independently of their sources, and sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I could see small figures standing in the corners of the room, watching Jake and me work. Jake was getting worse, developing tremors and reporting blackouts where he would lose minutes or hours, coming back to awareness in different locations with no memory of how he'd gotten there, and medical was starting to notice, scheduling him for evaluations that we both knew would end his career if he told the truth about what he was experiencing. On March 28, 2 weeks after the tank incident, we were assigned to another reconnaissance mission in the same sector, Command apparently unaware or unconcerned about our previous experience there, and as our Reaper approached the coordinates, both Jake and I felt a sensation like pressure in our ears, like descending too quickly in an aircraft. The destroyed tank was still there, a blackened hulk that should have been inert scrap metal, but on thermal it glowed with impossible patterns of heat that formed symbols that hurt to look at, and around it, the desert sand had been arranged in geometric patterns that extended for hundreds of meters, patterns that looked random from ground level but from altitude revealed their purposeful design. We reported the anomaly, requesting permission to abort the mission, but Colonel Webb ordered us to continue surveillance, and as we maintained our orbit, the patterns in the sand began to move, shifting and rearranging themselves in ways that suggested they were responding to our presence, as if they could feel the pressure of our observation from thousands of feet above. Jake started convulsing in his seat, his hands locked on the sensor controls, his eyes rolled back showing only whites, and when I tried to help him, to pull him away from the console, I felt a shock of connection that threw me back into my own seat, and suddenly I was seeing through multiple perspectives at once. I was in the control station at Creech, I was in the Reaper circling overhead, I was on the ground next to the destroyed tank, and I was somewhere else entirely, a place of impossible angles and writhing shadows where things that had never been human wore the shapes of children like masks, preparing for something I couldn't quite comprehend but knew would be catastrophic. The entities noticed my presence in their space, turning toward me with movements that existed in too many dimensions, and they spoke without words, directly into my consciousness, telling me that every drone strike, every missile impact, every death delivered from afar created tiny fractures in the fabric of spacetime, and they had been waiting for enough fractures to accumulate, enough cracks to widen into doorways. They showed me visions of what was coming, drone fleets turned into conduits for invasion, control stations becoming portal chambers, operators like myself transformed into living bridges between dimensions, our minds stretched across impossible distances until they snapped and let in things that would remake reality according to alien geometries. The connection broke when Jake screamed, a sound that shouldn't have been possible with human vocal cords, and I found myself back in the control station, alarms blaring as Jake seized on the floor, blood running from his eyes and ears, and on our screens, the Reaper's feed showed the desert patterns expanding, reaching up toward our aircraft like grasping fingers. Medical teams rushed in, sedating Jake and rushing him to the base hospital while I was pulled into an emergency debriefing, trying to explain what had happened while knowing that any truthful account would end my career, so I fell back on technical language, reporting equipment malfunctions and possible chemical exposure, anything but the truth. Jake never returned to duty, transferred to a psychiatric facility after the seizures continued, and he began speaking in languages that linguists couldn't identify, languages that hurt to hear and caused electronics to malfunction in his presence, and I heard rumors that he was eventually transferred to a black site facility that specialized in cases that couldn't be explained by conventional medicine. I was grounded pending psychological evaluation, spending my days in mandatory counseling sessions where I carefully avoided mentioning the true nature of what we'd experienced, while my nights were filled with dreams of drone feeds showing impossible vistas and the voices of entities explaining how they had been waiting so long for humanity to create the tools of its own conquest. The psychological evaluation cleared me for return to duty, but with restrictions: no combat missions, only training and administrative duties, which gave me access to systems and records I wouldn't normally have seen, and I used that access to dig deeper into the pattern Chen had identified, finding more and more incidents that fit the profile. There was a clear acceleration in the frequency of anomalous events, corresponding with the increasing use of drone warfare and the advancement of our weapons systems, as if each generation of technology created larger cracks in reality, and the entities were learning, adapting their methods to exploit our operational procedures and psychological weaknesses. I found references to a classified working group within the Pentagon, Project Gatekeeper, tasked with investigating and containing what they termed dimensional incursions related to remote warfare systems, and their reports, what little I could access, painted a terrifying picture of a phenomenon that was not only real but accelerating beyond their ability to control. Gatekeeper had identified specific mathematical relationships between drone operations and dimensional instability, equations that showed how the combination of distance, electromagnetic radiation, and directed violence created what they called causal loops, places where cause and effect became scrambled and linear time broke down, allowing things from outside normal spacetime to enter our reality. They had developed protocols to minimize these effects, specific flight patterns and targeting restrictions designed to reduce dimensional stress, but these protocols were being ignored in favor of operational efficiency, and each violation increased the risk of what their models termed a cascade event, a chain reaction of breaches that could not be contained. I started reaching out to other operators who had experienced anomalies, building a network of people who knew the truth, and what I found was that many of us were experiencing similar symptoms, shared dreams, peripheral visions, and a growing sense that we were being watched by intelligences that existed partially in our world and partially somewhere else. One operator, Captain Lisa Park, told me about a strike in Yemen where the target had appeared to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, forcing her to engage the same building 7 times before it finally stayed destroyed, and how afterwards, she would sometimes find herself in her apartment looking down at her own body from impossible angles, as if part of her consciousness was stuck in the drone's perspective. Another, Major James Wright, described hitting a convoy in Libya and watching through the feed as the destroyed vehicles drove away in directions that didn't exist on any map, leaving trails of light that formed patterns similar to what Jake and I had seen in Syria, and how he now heard constant whispers and frequencies that human ears shouldn't be able to detect. We began meeting in secret, sharing information and trying to develop countermeasures, but we were fighting something that operated by rules we didn't understand, using our own weapons systems against us in ways their designers never imagined, turning the distance that was supposed to protect us into a vulnerability that exposed us to things far worse than physical danger. On April 15, I was monitoring a training flight when every screen in the operations center began showing the same feed, not from any of our drones but from somewhere else, a perspective that seemed to be looking down at Earth from an impossible height, showing the entire planet covered in a web of fractures emanating from every location where a drone strike had ever occurred. The fractures pulsed with a sick light, and through them, things were beginning to push through, not all at once but in steady streams, entities that took whatever shape would allow them to exist in our physics, and at the center of it all, I could see Creech Air Force Base, transformed into something that hurt to perceive, a massive portal anchored by the accumulated trauma of thousands of remote killings. The vision lasted only seconds before the screens returned to normal, but everyone in the operations center had seen it, and the immediate lockdown and classification of the event told me that Command knew exactly what we had witnessed, that they had been expecting something like this and had protocols in place to contain not the phenomenon but knowledge of it. Over the following days, personnel who had been present during the vision were reassigned, transferred to different bases or different duties, scattered to prevent us from comparing notes or organizing, but the network we had built held, and through encrypted communications, we shared what was happening at our new assignments, the acceleration of anomalous events, the increasing boldness of the entities. I was transferred to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, officially to assist with training programs for new drone operators, but I quickly realized my real purpose was to be monitored, to be studied by personnel who knew about the contamination, as they called it, the changes that occurred in operators who had made contact with the other side through their screens. The facility at Davis-Monthan included a restricted medical wing where operators who had experienced severe anomalies were treated, though treatment seemed to consist mainly of observation and documentation, recording the progression of symptoms as test subjects slowly lost their grip on consensus reality, transforming into something that could perceive and interact with multiple dimensions simultaneously. I met Jake there, confined to a room lined with electromagnetic shielding that supposedly reduced his effect on electronics, though I could still feel the distortion in reality around him, the way space seemed to fold and unfold in his presence, and when he looked at me, I knew he was seeing more than just my physical form, seeing the connections that stretched back to every target I had ever engaged. He spoke in multiple voices, sometimes his own, sometimes the voices of people we had killed, sometimes voices that had never been human, telling me about the place between spaces where all drone operators eventually ended up. Our consciousness stretched across the network we had created with our violence, becoming nodes in a system the entities were using to reshape reality. The war, he sighed.